Matthean priority, sometimes pronounced Matthean priority, is the view that Matthew was the first of the Synoptic Gospels written. In the previous video, we considered Markan priority, the view that Mark was first, and we found that each of the major arguments was circular or reversible or both. In this video, we will make a case that Matthean priority is the best explanation of the evidence. We'll look at 3 major arguments, 3 minor arguments, and an abductive argument. Major argument number 1, the argument from order. We've danced around this one a few times in previous videos, now it's time to dive in. New Testament scholars have divided the Gospels up into what they call pericopes, or freestanding segments of text, often just a few verses, which you could pick up and move somewhere else and you'd keep the whole story. In order to cut down on the jargon, I will be very loosely referring to pericopes as stories in this video. The argument from order looks at the order in which these stories are presented. This is not to take a position on what's the correct order, and Jesus almost certainly would have told the same stories more than once, and none of the synoptic authors appear to have any desire to present their material in a strictly chronological order. The question rather is, if we see 2 Gospels presenting a lot of material in the same order, can we make a case that one is borrowing from the other? For years, the argument from order was a mainstay of Markan priority, perhaps most notably documented by B.H. Streeter in the 1920s. In his work on Markan priority, he used the argument from order as a foundational piece of his case that Mark was written first. There were several patterns he drew attention to. For example, Matthew and Mark will often have their material in the same order and Luke's order is different. That's called Matthew and Mark agreeing against Luke. There are also a number of occasions where Mark and Luke will have their material in the same order and Matthew's different. That's called Mark and Luke agreeing against Matthew. But Matthew and Luke never agree in order against Mark. Streeter said this is clear and compelling evidence that Mark was written first and Matthew and Luke are using Mark's order. And where there's no Mark to follow, they go their separate ways. Now this isn't quite right, because not only do Matthew and Luke frequently depart from Mark's order even when there is Mark to follow, but there are actually cases where there is no Mark to follow, just material that's shared by Matthew and Luke, and they have the same order sometimes. So I do think Streeter slightly overplayed the evidence, but his case was considered compelling at the time. Then, in the 1950s, B.C. Butler dismantled this argument with a trenchant criticism in which he referred to Streeter's conclusions based on the argument from order as a schoolboyish error in logical reasoning. He made a very simple analogy. Imagine you've got 3 students sitting next to each other in a line. We'll say their names are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew writes something on his paper. Then Mark looks over Matthew's shoulder and copies, but he changes up the order a little bit. Then Luke looks over Mark's shoulder and copies from Mark. He keeps Mark's order, but he adds some content. This is by no means a metaphor for all of the data in the synoptic problem. It's just specifically looking at the argument from order and why Streeter's conclusion doesn't work. Because in this case, Luke and Matthew will never agree in order against Mark, not because Mark was first, Matthew was first in this case, but because Luke copied Mark's order. What Butler demonstrated is that Streeter's own data are consistent with any possible arrangement of the first 3 Gospels. If we stopped the argument right there, we would have to say the argument from order doesn't tell us anything about the order in which the Gospels were written. But there's another layer of data. Butler did not pursue it in great detail, largely because the Catholic Church didn't want him to. But later scholars, like Farmer, Orchard, Peabody, and others, did, and it changed the face of synoptic studies. This is the argument that when it clicked for William Farmer, it changed his career. This is the argument that when it clicked for me, the synoptic problem came into focus. It will be helpful to display this pictorially. We'll use blue for Matthew, black for Mark, and red for Luke. Let's start with Streeter's assumption. Let's say this is the order in which the Gospel of Mark is written. Then Matthew comes along. Sometimes he follows Mark's order. Sometimes he goes off and does his own thing. Sometimes he follows Mark's order. Sometimes he goes and does his own thing. Sometimes he follows Mark, and so on. Based on this data alone, we can't actually conclude anything about the order in which the Gospels are written. We could just flip this around and say we think it was Matthew's order that was original, and it's Mark that's going back and forth. Enter Luke. You see, Luke also sometimes does his own thing and sometimes follows Mark's order. This is not to scale, and it does draw attention to the fact that there are cases where all three Gospels do have the same order. We're going to consider these two cases separately. You'll actually find them interspersed throughout the Gospel of Mark, cases where they all agree on order and cases where they have this alternating pattern. This doesn't tell us anything about the order in which the Gospels are written. This is also compatible with any possible arrangement. But this material does. A pattern we see over and over again, particularly in the first half of Mark. Matthew will agree with Mark's order. And then where Matthew stops agreeing with Mark, Luke starts agreeing with Mark. Then where Luke stops agreeing with Mark, that's right where Matthew picks up and starts agreeing with Mark. Back and forth. What's going on here? Why are they taking turns following Mark's order? Why are they so focused on, I need to follow Mark when the other author didn't, but they're ambivalent about it when the other author did? Did Luke say, okay, I like following Mark's order and I'll follow him a lot, except when Matthew did? Do I really have to follow what Matthew did? So maybe if I really have to, sometimes I'll follow Mark's order still, even if Matthew did, but often I won't. Or did Matthew and Luke get together and say, hey, you writing a gospel? Yeah, me too. Okay, well, let's make for darn sure, whatever else we do, that at least one of us is always following Mark's order. Heaven knows why that's important, but let's make sure we do it. So Matthew says, okay, I'll follow Mark here, so you can go off and do your own thing. But I need you to have my back, because I've got something special planned over here, and I need you to follow Mark during this section. And Luke says, okay, that's fine, but don't leave me with this. You better come back, because I'm going to do something else over here. I'm not going to follow Mark's order here, so you need to. What's going on here? This is what David Barrett Peabody pithily referred to as they neatly divided Mark's gospel between them. This is a real problem for the two-source hypothesis that suggests that neither Matthew knew Luke's gospel nor Luke knew Matthew's, meaning this pattern would had to have emerged entirely by accident. I suggest this is wildly implausible. But even if one or both authors did intentionally put this pattern into their gospel, why in the world would they do it? Why add a mountain of complexity to the already complex, to say nothing of expensive, process of writing a gospel? Why put so much effort into developing a pattern that, for all they knew, nobody was ever going to see? We cannot infer that they knew at the time of writing these documents that all three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were going to survive for centuries, because this pattern only shows up if you've got all three. And we cannot infer that they knew that at some future date, the Gospels were going to be compiled into a set, along with John, who has nothing to do with this order, and that these documents would be sent all around the world as a set, and they would be the most widely compared and studied documents in human history. We can't infer any of that knowledge back on them. Why would they go to such lengths to create this pattern? Why would they add a mountain to their workload? A pattern that's going to be obscured by all the non-Markan data they include anyway. And if it were so important to them, if it were such a foundational issue to get this pattern, then why did they mess it up? There are actually instances where all three Gospels disagree in order. Not very many, but if they cared so much about it, well, they dropped the ball. They didn't actually quite execute on it. To suggest that the Gospel authors were putting in some kind of code or riddle that you would only be able to find if you had all three Gospels and you subtracted out the non-Markan material, this is the stuff of conspiracy theories. We can study these Gospels and see the themes and structure with which they're put together. There is a clear structure to the Gospel of Matthew. There's a clear structure to the Gospel of Luke, and it has nothing to do with this pattern. I suggest we don't have any good reason to impose this structure upon the intentions of the authors when they haven't given us any reason to believe it's important to them, and there's no discernible theological value to it either. It would be irrational for Matthew and Luke to have done this on purpose, and it would be implausible for them to have done it by accident. Then how does this remarkable pattern emerge? Remember, we started this diagram with the assumption that Mark's Gospel was written first. Let's walk back that assumption and try a different one. There's no need to try to explain an extraordinarily complex solution when there is a much, much, much simpler solution available. Let's imagine that Matthew is written first. Here's Matthew's order. Luke comes along. Most of the time he doesn't follow Matthew's order, but occasionally he does. Again, this is not to scale. These two instances are interspersed, but we're going to consider them separately to see how Mark responds in each case. When Matthew and Luke agree in order, Mark follows their order 100% of the time. Where Matthew and Luke have the same order and Mark chooses to include that story in his gospel, Mark follows Matthew and Luke's order 100% of the time. You rarely get 100% on anything in a study of ancient history, and here we've got one. And what about when they don't agree in order? Well, then you can't follow both of them. What Mark does, he follows Matthew for a bit. He follows Luke for a bit. Okay, I like the order that Matthew put those several stories in, I'll follow that. And then Luke's got that same story, and then after that he's got a really nice sequence, I'll follow Luke for a bit. He alternates between his sources. A very sensible thing to do if you're drawing material from two different sources. And so rather than a much more complex arrangement, trying to figure out how they did this and how they knew when one was going to start and one was going to stop following Mark, we've got a very clean and simple solution here. Where Mark's sources agree in order, he follows their order. Where they don't agree in order, he necessarily cannot follow both of them, and so he chooses one or the other. Mark's method makes a lot of sense, especially when you consider that his sources are written on scrolls that aren't broken down by chapter and verse. How do you find what you're looking for on a scroll? It's very helpful to know the order of the contents. So you find a story, okay, yeah, the one I'm looking for is 3 stories after that, or it's the story right before this. And so what I see in Mark is he's very familiar with the contents of Matthew and Luke. If somebody had preached regularly using these documents as sources, they would be familiar with the order. And so Mark takes some of the order from Matthew and he takes some of the order from Luke. As Harold Riley pointed out, there is a clear process by which Mark draws material as he works his way through Matthew and through Luke. But we cannot make that same argument if it's the other way around and Mark was written first and Matthew and Luke are drawing material from Mark. Rather than trying to come up with a convoluted explanation for how Matthew and Luke divided Mark between them and knew when to start and when the other one was going to stop and so on, we've got a very clear process that works if Mark was written third. And fantastically, not only does this work at the macro level, the order of the stories in the Gospels, it's also there at the micro level of individual words and phrases. We actually see Mark alternating between the use of Matthew's words and phrases and Luke's words and phrases. And where Mark is following Matthew's order, he follows Matthew's words more closely. Where Mark is following Luke's order, he follows Luke's words more closely. This makes the case for Mark being written first even worse, because now not only do Matthew and Luke have to split Mark's stories between them, they have to go down to the level of individual words. If it was bad enough to have to do this at the story level, now to suggest Matthew and Luke are so carefully splitting Mark's words between them and dividing them up at this level, or that happened by chance, this is not a tenable explanation, especially when there is a clean and simple alternative in which Mark was written third. We've now looked at a number of diagrams. Let's apply some math to this data. I'll be looking at a 1982 paper by Malcolm Lowe in which he called out the demise of arguments from order for Mark and priority, and he relied upon the pericope subdivisions by Joseph Tyson. Using formal logic, he evaluated the proposition that Mark was used by Matthew and Luke as a source, that is, Mark was first, versus the proposition that Mark used Matthew and Luke as sources, that is, Mark was third, and compared the evidence that could be used for each of them. I highly recommend his paper if you'd like to go through the formal logical proof. What he found is, yes, there's plenty of data that is consistent with both of these hypotheses, but any data from the argument from order that is consistent with the expectations if Mark was first will also be consistent with the expectations if Mark was third. So any data that supports this one also supports this one, but the inverse is not true. You can, and we do have data consistent with the expectations if Mark was third that is not consistent with the data if Mark was first. You can have evidence that contradicts Mark being first that does not contradict Mark being third. Now, what do I mean by the expected order? That is, if this gospel is the source and this gospel is the one using the source, what order do we expect to find the material in the second gospel? Every synoptic theory acknowledges there will be exceptions. But how many exceptions are we talking about? On a 90 pericope count, that is saying that there are 90 stories found in all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Depending on how you subdivide the stories, you could come up with a 98 count. It will change the fractions slightly, but won't do anything to the argument. We'll use a 90 count here. What is the explanatory power of each of these hypotheses? If Mark were first, the data is consistent with what we would expect if Mark were first. 57 times out of 90. The rest are exceptions. All of that data is also consistent with Mark being third. That was one of the great insights by Lowe. Any data that supports this one will support this one, but not the other way around. If Mark's third, the actual data in the gospel supports what we would predict. 88 times out of 90. This is incredible. We have a hypothesis with far greater predictive power. Now, some will say, well, Matthew and Luke don't deviate from Mark's order very often. What do we mean not very often? We've got 33 exceptions here. More than a third of the data are exceptions. To suggest that this hypothesis is better than the one that's right 88 times out of 90 sounds to me a bit like special pleading. And we still don't have a good reason why it was so important for Matthew and Luke to try to make sure that always at least one of them was following Mark's order. Given the very complex explanations we had to reach to figure out how this order could emerge if Mark was first, versus a very simple process if Mark was third, given the explanatory power of the hypothesis that Mark was third, based on the order you would expect to find the material in, I suggest we have a really good case that Mark was written third. Now, some astute observers might say, wait a minute, couldn't you draw a mirror image of all your diagrams and say it was Luke that was first and Matthew that was second? At the level at which we have considered the argument from order, yes, we could. Good observation. If we want to dive more deeply into the argument from order than we have time for right now, we would find that it is more challenging to make the case that Luke was written first. However, we're going to defer our discussion of the relationship between Matthew and Luke for subsequent arguments in this video. The key takeaway from the argument from order is that Mark first is a very convoluted explanation that creates more problems than it solves. Mark third is a remarkably simple and very effective hypothesis. The decisive data point we derive from the argument from order is that we have compelling reason to believe that Mark was the third gospel written.